I will make the introduction brief because our next speaker, General Brent Scowcroft, is fast approaching the status of a Washington monument, and I say that admiringly. This is a city of politics. In politics, a day is a lifetime and tomorrow is forever. Brent Scowcroft came to national prominence as a Deputy Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs from 1973 to 75, became the Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs under President Ford. Since then has been called upon by every administration, and President Bush, in one of his most widely acclaimed choices, named General Scowcroft to be his Assistant for National Security Affairs. A graduate of the United States Military Academy, he taught Russian history at West Point in a burst of prescience rarely found in our city. He has an M.A. from Columbia, Ph.D. from Georgetown. He's taught political science at the United States Air Force Academy. He's a pilot, and he's a lot more interesting than anything else I could say about him. General Brent Scowcroft.
Thank you very much, Mark. It's great to be here with you. From the looks of the people speaking, there isn't anything else going on in the government than sharing our views with you all. I thought that I might spend just a few minutes putting into a little perspective some of the kinds of things we're doing. Can't cover the world at all, so I'm going to focus on a particular part. But in terms of what broader themes, what may be going on in the world, and what I'd like to suggest is that we may be at one of those historic periods of transition when we're really moving from one age to another. And you never know whether you're in one till it's over and you can look back and say, yes, that's what's happened. But just sort of follow with me where we are now and where we have been. What we all have been living in for the last 40 years is the post-war world, the post-war generation, when the United States inherited a world flat on its back after the war, with a rising threat by a power that said, we're going to inherit the world. And since that time, we have been grappling with that world. We put our friends and our foreign enemies back on their feet and so on. That's thriving. We've nurtured the third world into the post-colonial era. We're dealing with the Soviet Union. But all of our focus up to now has been on the post-war world. Well, now the world's moving on. The post-war world is gone. Our allies and our former enemies are now thriving democracies, closely allied with us but economic competitors. The new threat, the Soviet Union, is having enormous problems of its own. In almost every sense you look at it, American foreign policy since the war has been a tremendous success. We're now talking from our agenda, political pluralism, market economics. Our enemies, those who have the alternative vision of the world, are now more and more openly abandoning it and moving to adopt the things from our world. In that sense, we have won. But now you see we're moving into a new world. And that's what makes many of the tried and true nostrums that we've been practicing for the last 40 years no longer quite so tried and true. And President Bush may be the first president, first new man in office since World War II to have a whole different kind of a world, who has not come into office inheriting the post-war agenda, whether it's relationships with our friends or the Cold War. And that is what it is that we're really focusing on now. And let me just say a few words about especially the European West, East, and Soviet part of it. The most dramatic, of course, is what's going on in the Soviet Union at the present time. And the President outlined a policy toward the Soviet Union last May in which he said, we hope to move beyond containment. Now, there's a lot in that phrase, because since 1917, the Soviet Union has been saying and acting on the principle that the world was not big enough for both philosophies, and that socialism, Marxism, Leninism, whatever you want to call it, inevitably was going to inherit the world. And whether we talked about détente in the 70s, peaceful coexistence and so on, it was all different ways of managing this struggle, this mortal struggle between two different systems. And it just may be now that we can look beyond containment, which was our idea of holding the line against this aggressive ideology, holding the line until it changed, that we've won that too. And we can look beyond it, beyond a Soviet Union determined one way or another to overthrow the world as it is, into a Soviet Union prepared, not necessarily to be friendly, but prepared to take its place as a member of the international community, not as a mortal threat to the international community. We have a long way to go, and there are signs, there are both good signs and bad signs. But if you look back over even in the last 5 years since Gorbachev came into office, some of the things that we're now hearing and seeing now would have been absolutely unimaginable just 5 years ago. In Eastern Europe, the Cold War really started in Eastern Europe. That was the Iron Curtain that went down. And now we see, in various degrees in Eastern Europe, the alien regimes that were imposed upon a group of European peoples are now in the process of being thrown off. And it's a very exciting period, a very delicate period, in which there are both opportunities and dangers. And again, our policy has been to encourage differentiation in Eastern Europe, but not on the basis, which was the previous policy, on the basis of their distance from the Soviet Union, which in earlier decades, of course, led us to reach out a hand to Romania, for example, but on the basis of their interest in political pluralism and in opening up their economic systems. And therefore, of course, we are extending a hand to Hungary and to Poland. And as we see the astonishing events in East Germany, where the most Stalinist, I think one would have to say, of the Eastern European countries is in a basic condition of turmoil. So there's a lot of promise here, still a lot of dangers. A lot of things can happen, both in the Soviet Union and in Eastern Europe. So we do have to move with care. We want to make progress, and in some cases, I know we're criticized for going too slowly, criticized with being timid and so on. But if we look back in the past, one of the things that has happened from moving too fast is a reaction which has set the process back for some time. Western Europe. This is much less dramatic, but perhaps no less fundamental to U.S. foreign policy and to the shape of the world to come. And that is the European move to the single market, to the kind of integration that we and the Europeans have been talking about really since the days of Carl Monet, but which has been such a long time in coming. this could be a very fundamental transformation. It's one about which the United States have had a lot of ambivalence. But again, the President has said, we've looked at it, and European integration, economic integration, and close political integration is in the U.S. interest. We favor it, we support it. They are natural friends, they are natural allies, we do have a common heritage. Will it cause problems? Sure, in some respects. But so long as the move to integration in Europe is not inward-looking, is not a move toward a closed system, but rather an opening up to a broader system, an Atlantic system, then it is very much in the U.S. national interest. And we're working with the Europeans to ensure the extent to which we can that it is an open, outward-looking unification. So there are really some very fundamental things going on in the world now, things which in our lifetime we've not seen before, and it's pretty heady stuff. The last thing I will mention, just very briefly, is President last weekend went down to Puerto Rico to celebrate 100 years of democracy for Puerto Rico, which is another phenomenon which is occurring most dramatically in Latin America, but in many places in the world, and that is a resurgence of democracy. It was not many years ago when Latin America had just a very handful of struggling democracies. Now, the dictators, the caudillos, are a dwindling handful of people. And one of the remaining dictators, Ortega, who showed up at this meeting on democracy in his military uniform and left before it was over, given the circumstances, are on the way out, and it's up to the United States to do what it can to ensure this is not simply a cyclical phenomenon, but a move toward a hemisphere, a democratic hemisphere. And we made enormous progress toward it. There are a number of problems in Latin America, and a number of the problems bring democracy in many of these areas under threat. We will be trying to work with our now the great democratic majority to ensure the success of democracy and of the kinds of economic systems which will undergird it and give it the strength to survive. On top of all these seminal events taking place in the world, of course, you know, there are the standard problems, U.S.-Japanese relations, a particular one, Middle East, Southern Africa, and a variety. But what I wanted to point out to you today are what I think are the really epoch-making events that are underway, which are going to transform the world in which we live, especially if we can play our cards right. And now, I have a few minutes. I'd be happy to take some questions. Anybody has it? Yes, sir.
There is a microphone there if you wouldn't mind using it. Okay? Thank you.
Anybody else who has a question, if you wouldn't mind going to a microphone, it would make it just easier for everybody else to hear that question.
Perhaps I could ask a question in relation to the help that America is prepared to give to Eastern Europe. That the Americans, after the war, assured the future of democracy with the Marshall Plan. America is now a minor aid giver in the world firmament. perhaps you could say whether the American people wish to assure the future of Eastern Europe with a similar sort of plan and a much improved purse than the one that appears to be on offer at present.
That's a very good question, and I think it points out a major distinction that we have to make, and that is between the task, especially in a country like Poland, and the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan was based on a need for capital to restore infrastructure, to restore industrial capability. The economic systems were in place, the managerial skills were in place, everything was in place, the need was for capital. That is not the case in Poland. What we need in Poland is to transform an economy that is a statist economy, state-owned, state-run, inefficient, pricing systems wholly artificial, companies, enterprises, managed, run for their political interests and so on, not because of their economic viability. There are some very fundamental things that have to take place. And simply pouring money is not going to do it. What the Poles need, importantly, of course they need money. They need our help in doing something which has never been done before, and that is taking one of these statist economic system. It's the problem that has been bedeviling the Chinese. It's bedeviling the Soviets right now. This is a very, very difficult thing to do. We gave the Poles, under very different circumstances, the Poles were given an awful lot of money in the early 70s by the Americans, by the Europeans. It turned out to have been a contribution to their economic malaise now rather than a help. What we need is a judicious blending of economic aid and the program to which that aid will be dedicated to do the kinds of restructuring that only the Poles can do. We can't do it for them. We can tell them what we think they need to do, but it's going to be a tough time for them. Anybody else? Yes, sir. Yes.
What about the relation of the United States with the other Eastern Asian country like China or Vietnam?
And what about them?
The relation between the United States.
The relations between the United States and China and the East Asian countries. Yes. A comparison of the Chinese and the Soviet moves is very interesting. You know, the Chinese so far have been almost all perestroika and no glasnost. The Soviets have been almost all glasnost and very little perestroika. The Chinese have run into serious problems. And it remains to be seen, you know, whether the pacing of these two, political reform and economic reform, whether the Soviets will manage it better. What happened in Tiananmen Square tugged at the heartstrings of all Americans. It was a serious setback. There's no question about it. What we have to remember now, though, is that the China of today is very different than the China of 1972, and that U.S.-Chinese relations since 1972 have evolved in a pattern very different from the 25 years before that, when, if you will recall, the proximate cause of the two largest wars that we have fought since World War II, both in Korea and in Vietnam, were intimately involved with China. We must remember that this is an important country. We have an important relationship with China. With the Asian world, we also have an important relationship. It is harder to manage it as a group than it is the Europeans, because there is no Asia in the sense that there is a Europe. There is no kind of natural community, so that it almost by necessity deal with them in a more individualistic way. But it is a dynamic part of the world. In Asia, by and large, the management of economies, with a few notable exceptions, has been much more skillfully done than in other areas of the world. And we're looking forward to a period. For example, if the conflict in Cambodia can ever be resolved, to a transformation, a gradual transformation of the period in Southeast Asia. We have a long way to go there. But if we can bring the conflicts to an end, I think that the dynamism that you see in the newly industrialized countries and in those that are standing right behind them are very exciting for the United States. Everybody?
Just one more question. Is there anybody have a question?
Yes, sir.
General Scowcroft.
Can you comment on the stability of the East Bloc at this moment and the sustainability of the rapid changes there? Is maybe the detente between East and West now more vulnerable than it was, for instance, 2 years ago?
That's a really very good question. Could we comment on the stability of Eastern Europe and the rapidity with which changes are made there? Is there not something about which we need to be concerned there? Yes, there really is. And I think there is no more sensitive aspect to the whole thing than the relationship of the two Germanys. And East Germany in particular has a terrible problem now. There is no such thing as an East German nationality. East Germany distinguishes itself as a state by its political and economic system, by a Stalinist political system and a statist economic system. To the extent that it reforms, it loses its reason for being a separate entity. And that poses a particular problem, both for the East German government and for us in how this thing unfolds. I don't think anybody can predict exactly what is going to happen, but we all need to keep our wits about us to try to behave very prudently and carefully, because the situation could become explosive. And I'm not suggesting it will, but it is extremely sensitive, and we really do, in this sense, are seeing the collapse of an artificial development in the post-war world that is now coming apart, and we have to hope that can be managed in a peaceful and productive manner. Thank you all very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you, General Scowcroft. We now have lunch, and General Scowcroft's colleague from the White House, Governor John Sununu, the President's Chief of Staff, will be our speaker at lunch. Thank you.